Stay with me, because sometimes the most devastating betrayal doesn't happen years into a marriage. It happens before the wedding night is even over. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the top floor of the Grand Crescent Hotel, carrying Evelyn Carter toward what she believed would be the happiest moment of her life. Outside, the Manhattan skyline shimmered beneath a velvet summer sky, its endless lights reflecting against the floor-to-ceiling windows like thousands of promises waiting to be fulfilled. At 28 years old and 12 weeks pregnant, Evelyn rested one hand gently against her abdomen while the other held the silver room key Nathan Brooks had slipped into her palm only an hour earlier. "Meet me upstairs," he had whispered after the last dance, smiling with the same charming confidence that had made investors trust him, magazine covers celebrate him, and eventually convinced her that she had found the kind of love most people only dreamed about. The ballroom downstairs still echoed faintly with applause, laughter, and the distant melody of their final wedding song. Family members were celebrating. Friends were raising champagne glasses. Somewhere, photographers were editing pictures that would soon appear across social media beneath captions about fairy tale romance and forever. None of them knew forever was already beginning to crack. Evelyn smiled to herself as she stepped into the quiet hallway lined with polished marble, fresh white orchids, and golden wall sconces casting a warm glow across the expensive carpet. Every detail looked exactly the way Nathan insisted it should. Perfect, elegant, flawless. She adjusted the simple satin wrap around her shoulders, remembering how he had kissed her forehead before slipping away to take what he called an important business call. 5 minutes, he had promised. Then the night belongs to us. 5 minutes had become 30. She wasn't worried. Nathan's company was closing a multi-million-dollar acquisition the following week. Emergencies happened. That was simply the price of building an empire. Still, something felt strangely different tonight. Not frightening. Just quiet. Too quiet. As she approached the presidential suite, she noticed the door wasn't fully closed. A thin ribbon of warm light spilled into the hallway. She hesitated, lifting her hand to knock before stopping when unfamiliar laughter drifted through the opening. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was intimate enough to make her heartbeat stumble. "Nathan?" She called softly, expecting him to answer immediately. Instead, the laughter stopped. Silence settled over the room like dust after a storm. Evelyn frowned. Maybe hotel staff had entered by mistake. Maybe wedding planners were collecting decorations. She gently pushed the door open another few inches. The scent of expensive perfume mixed with fresh roses floated into the hallway. 2 champagne glasses rested on a nearby table. One lipstick mark stained the rim of a crystal flute that definitely hadn't belonged to her. Her pulse quickened. "Nathan?" She repeated, louder this time. Then she heard his voice. Calm, relaxed, entirely different from the hurried businessman she thought she'd married. She'll figure it out eventually. Every muscle in Evelyn's body froze. She couldn't see them yet. Only shadows moving beyond the sitting room near the panoramic windows overlooking Central Park. Another woman's voice answered with an amused laugh. "You really married her anyway." Nathan chuckled quietly. It was easier this way. The words barely rose above a whisper, but they landed heavier than thunder. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the room key until the metal edge pressed into her palm. Her breathing slowed without her meaning it to. Instinct told her to walk away. Curiosity rooted her to the floor. She took one careful step forward, then another. The city lights reflected against the glass wall, revealing 2 familiar silhouettes standing closer together than strangers ever would. Nathan Brooks still wore the tuxedo she had helped straighten only hours earlier. Across from him stood Vanessa Collins, one of the marketing executives from his company, still wearing the emerald green evening gown Evelyn had complimented during the reception. Neither of them had noticed the door opening wider behind them. Nathan lifted his champagne glass slightly before speaking again. "After the baby is born, everything becomes much simpler." Vanessa smiled with complete confidence. "And until then?" Nathan answered without hesitation. "Nothing changes." Evelyn didn't gasp. She didn't cry out. She simply stood there as every beautiful memory from the past 2 years quietly rearranged itself into something she no longer recognized. The engagement, the promises, the gentle reassurances whenever she doubted herself, the joyful announcement that they were expecting a baby. Every moment suddenly carried questions she had never thought to ask. The silence inside the suite stretched endlessly until the room key slipped from her trembling fingers onto the marble floor. The tiny metallic sound echoed through the suite. Nathan turned first. His confident smile disappeared the instant his eyes met hers. For several endless seconds, no one spoke. 3 people stood beneath the glittering Manhattan skyline, while an entire future unraveled without a single raised voice. And in that impossible silence, Evelyn Carter realized the wedding had ended long before the marriage ever had the chance to begin. The room remained perfectly still after the metallic sound of the fallen key faded into silence. Nathan took one uncertain step forward, his polished dress shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor. "Evelyn," he said quietly, as though lowering his voice could somehow soften what she had just witnessed. She looked at him without anger, without tears, and somehow that frightened him more than any emotional outburst ever could. Vanessa slowly set her champagne glass onto the nearby table, folding her arms with practiced confidence before offering a smile that looked more rehearsed than sincere. "This is not what it looks like," Nathan continued. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice calm enough to surprise even herself. "Then tell me what it is." Nathan opened his mouth, but no explanation came. The expensive suite suddenly felt much smaller than before. Outside, traffic moved across Fifth Avenue, tiny headlights flowing through Manhattan as though the rest of the city had no idea that an entire future had just collapsed inside one luxury hotel room. Evelyn glanced toward the panoramic windows where reflections from the skyline blurred together with the 3 figures standing in silence. Less than 2 hours earlier, she had stood beneath crystal chandeliers wearing the white gown she had dreamed about since childhood. Guests applauded as Nathan promised to love and honor her for the rest of their lives. His parents smiled proudly from the front row. Her mother had quietly wiped away tears of joy. Even the wedding officiant had commented that genuine devotion could be seen in the way Nathan looked at his bride. Evelyn remembered believing every word. Now every memory replayed differently, as though someone had replaced the soundtrack of her life with a quieter, colder version of the truth. She looked toward the abandoned champagne glasses again. There had been 2. There had always been 2. Nathan stepped closer. "Please let me explain everything." She raised one hand gently, stopping him before he could shorten the distance between them. "When did it start?" she asked. Nathan hesitated for only a second, but it was enough. Silence answered before he did. Vanessa finally broke it. "Long before tonight." Nathan turned sharply toward her. "Vanessa." She shrugged lightly. "She deserves honesty now, does not she?" Evelyn closed her eyes for one brief moment. The baby had been quiet throughout the evening, but now she felt the faintest flutter beneath her heart. It was small, almost impossible to notice, yet it reminded her that she was no longer making decisions for only herself. She rested her hand against her abdomen, breathing slowly until her pulse steadied. Nathan noticed the gesture immediately. "Evelyn, please do not leave like this. Think about our child." Those words lingered in the air. Our child. Just minutes earlier, she had heard him describe the pregnancy as though it were another business arrangement waiting for the right timing. The contradiction landed harder than anything else. She looked directly into his eyes. "I am thinking about my child." Nathan searched her face for the woman he thought he understood, the woman who usually searched for compromise before conflict, who believed conversations could repair almost anything. Instead, he found someone remarkably composed. That frightened him because calm decisions often lasted longer than emotional ones. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed the wedding ring box that the photographer had used during the ceremony for close-up pictures. "We can fix this," he insisted. "Nothing happened that cannot be explained." Evelyn looked at the small velvet box for several seconds before answering. "The explanation is not the problem." Nathan frowned. "Then what is?" "Trust." One word. Quietly spoken. Impossible to argue with. Vanessa shifted awkwardly for the first time that evening, suddenly realizing she was no longer watching a dramatic confrontation. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no scenes that could later be dismissed as emotional confusion. There was only clarity. Evelyn bent slowly, picked up the silver room key from the floor, and placed it on the nearby entry table beside the bouquet she had carried down the aisle only hours earlier. White roses, white lilies, white ribbons. symbols of a future that no longer existed. She slipped her wedding ring from her finger with steady hands and rested it beside the key. Nathan stared at it, as though the tiny circle of gold weighed more than everything he owned. "If you walk out that door," he said quietly, "everything changes." Evelyn met his eyes one final time. "It already has." Without another word, she turned toward the hallway. The hotel corridor was as peaceful as before, the soft lights glowing warmly against polished marble, while distant laughter drifted upward from guests still celebrating downstairs. Nobody noticed the bride walking alone through the silent hallway, carrying nothing except her evening wrap and the life growing inside her. Behind the closed suite door, Nathan remained frozen where he stood, convinced she simply needed time to calm down. He believed morning would bring forgiveness, conversations, and another chance to rewrite the night. He did not yet understand that some doors close without slamming, and the quietest goodbyes are often the ones that never open again. The revolving doors of the Grand Crescent Hotel turned slowly behind Evelyn as she stepped into the warm Manhattan night, leaving the celebration, the music, and the man she had believed would be her future behind a wall of polished glass. The city continued exactly as it had before. Yellow taxis rolled through traffic. Street musicians played on the corner. Couples laughed as they disappeared into restaurants still open long past midnight. It amazed her that the world could remain so ordinary while her own had quietly fallen apart. She pulled her satin wrap closer around her shoulders and took a slow breath, trying to steady the thoughts racing through her mind. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stay. Her phone vibrated inside her evening clutch. "Nathan." She looked at the screen until it stopped ringing. A second call arrived almost immediately. Then another. Then a message. "Please come back. We need to talk." She locked the screen without reading anything else. Across the street, the fountain in Bryant Park reflected thousands of tiny lights, reminding her of another evening almost 2 years earlier when Nathan had first brought her there after a charity fundraiser. He had seemed different from every successful businessman she had ever met. He listened more than he spoke. He remembered details from conversations weeks later. He noticed when she preferred tea instead of coffee and quietly ordered it before she even reached the table. Friends told her she had found one of the rare wealthy men who still valued kindness over appearances. Looking back now, she wondered how much of that kindness had been genuine and how much had simply been careful preparation. Memory became a dangerous thing once trust disappeared. Every smile demanded a second interpretation. Every promise carried a hidden question. Every perfect moment suddenly seemed rehearsed. Another vibration interrupted her thoughts. This time it was her mother. Evelyn stared at the familiar name without answering. She could already imagine the excitement in her mother's voice, asking whether the honeymoon suite overlooked Central Park or whether the wedding cake tasted as wonderful as it looked. How could she explain that the marriage had ended before the honeymoon had even begun? She slipped the phone back into her purse and continued walking. The heels that had felt elegant only hours earlier now seemed impossibly heavy against the sidewalk. A cool breeze carried the scent of rain drifting in from the Hudson River, lifting loose strands of her hair as she reached a quiet bench overlooking the park. She lowered herself carefully onto the wooden seat and rested both hands over the small life growing beneath her heart. "I promise," she whispered into the darkness, "I will never build your future on someone else's lies." The words surprised even her. They were not spoken from anger. They came from something calmer, something stronger. Her phone vibrated again. This time the message preview appeared before she could look away. "I can explain everything. It was not what you think." She almost laughed. She had heard his own voice. She had watched his expression before he realized she was standing in the doorway. No explanation could erase that moment because the betrayal had not begun inside the hotel suite. It had simply been revealed there. Somewhere behind the clouds, thunder rolled softly across the city. A few drops of rain touched the pavement. Guests from nearby restaurants hurried beneath awnings while doormen opened umbrellas for arriving visitors. Evelyn remained exactly where she was. The gentle rain felt strangely comforting, washing away traces of expensive perfume, champagne, and memories that no longer belonged to her. Nearly 20 minutes passed before another message appeared. It came from someone she had not expected. "Vanessa." There was no apology, only one sentence. "He was never completely honest with either of us." Evelyn read the message twice before locking her phone again. That single sentence raised more questions than answers. Had Nathan been deceiving only his wife? Or had he been living different versions of himself with everyone around him? Investors trusted him with millions of dollars. Employees admired his leadership. Friends described him as loyal. Families toasted his integrity only hours earlier beneath crystal chandeliers. How many people truly knew the man behind the carefully polished image? The rain grew steadier, tapping softly against the leaves overhead. Evelyn finally stood and looked back toward the towering hotel one last time. Several upper-floor windows still glowed against the dark skyline. Somewhere behind one of them, Nathan was almost certainly convinced that enough flowers, enough expensive gifts, or enough carefully chosen words could repair what had been broken. He had spent years solving problems by throwing resources at them until they disappeared. He had never learned that trust followed different rules. As another taxi slowed beside the curb, the driver lowered his window. "Need a ride, miss?" Evelyn nodded quietly before opening the rear door. "Where to?" he asked. She looked out across the endless lights of Manhattan for several silent seconds. For the first time in years, she did not have an answer. And somehow, not knowing where she was going felt far less frightening than knowing exactly where she had been. Evelyn finally answered the driver's question with the only destination that felt safe. "Penn Station, please." She did not intend to board a train. She simply needed a place where nobody would think to look for a newly married bride still wearing part of her wedding attire. The driver nodded and merged into the late-night traffic without asking another question. Manhattan rolled past the rain-speckled windows and streaks of gold and silver, while the soft jazz station playing through the speakers filled the silence neither of them seemed interested in breaking. Evelyn rested her forehead lightly against the cool glass and watched strangers hurry through crosswalks carrying umbrellas, grocery bags, and briefcases. Their ordinary lives felt strangely comforting. Somewhere among millions of people, her heartbreak was invisible. That realization hurt, but it also gave her strength. She was no longer the center of a fairy tale. She was simply another woman beginning again. Across town, Nathan stood alone inside the silent presidential suite. The celebration downstairs had finally ended, and one by one, guests were returning to their own lives with photographs full of smiling faces and carefully edited memories. His phone remained in his hand. 23 unanswered calls. 14 text messages. No response. He loosened his bow tie and stared at the wedding ring Evelyn had left beside the room key. The gold circle reflected the city lights with cruel simplicity. He convinced himself she needed a few hours to calm down. By sunrise, she would answer. By breakfast, they would meet. By tomorrow night, this entire disaster would become an unpleasant misunderstanding they could move beyond. Nathan had spent his career negotiating impossible deals. He believed every conflict had a solution if approached with enough patience and enough resources. He did not realize that love was the one contract that could not survive once trust had quietly expired. His phone suddenly rang. "Vanessa." He answered immediately. "Have you heard from her?" Nathan asked. "No," Vanessa replied calmly. "But you should stop calling every 5 minutes." Nathan rubbed his forehead. "She is pregnant." "I know. She cannot disappear." Vanessa hesitated before speaking again. "You still believe this is about tonight?" Nathan frowned. "What else would it be?" Her answer came almost as a whisper. "It is about every decision that led to tonight." Before he could respond, the call ended. Nathan looked once more toward the empty doorway where Evelyn had quietly walked away. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. Not fear of losing money. Not fear of damaging his reputation. Fear of consequences that could not be negotiated. Meanwhile, the taxi stopped outside Penn Station. Evelyn thanked the driver, stepped onto the wet sidewalk, and walked inside the brightly lit terminal. Travelers dragged rolling suitcases toward departure boards while families reunited beneath glowing signs announcing trains to Boston, Washington, and Philadelphia. Nobody recognized her. Nobody knew she had been married only hours earlier. She found an empty seat beneath a large departure screen and finally answered one call. It was not Nathan. It was her closest friend, Claire Bennett. "Evelyn." Claire's voice trembled with concern. "Everyone is looking for you. Your mother is worried. Nathan says there has been a misunderstanding." Evelyn closed her eyes. There was no misunderstanding. Silence lingered between them. Finally, Claire asked the question no one else had. Are you safe? Evelyn looked around the busy station, listening to announcements echo overhead and the steady rhythm of trains arriving below ground. Yes, she answered honestly. For the first time tonight, I think I am. Claire did not pressure her for details. Come to my apartment, she said softly. Stay as long as you need. Evelyn smiled for the first time since leaving the hotel. Thank you. Less than an hour later, she quietly arrived at Claire's Upper West Side apartment carrying nothing except her evening clutch and the satin wrap still draped around her shoulders. Claire opened the door before Evelyn even knocked. One look at her friend's face was enough. No questions. No dramatic reactions. She simply wrapped a blanket around Evelyn's shoulders, guided her to the living room, and placed a mug of warm herbal tea on the coffee table. The apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and vanilla, a comforting contrast to the polished perfection of the hotel she had left behind. As dawn slowly approached beyond the apartment windows, Evelyn stood alone, overlooking the sleeping city. The engagement ring was gone. The wedding gown was gone. The future she had imagined was gone. Yet beneath her heart, one steady reminder remained. She gently rested her hand against her abdomen and smiled through quiet tears that never became sobs. Nathan believed she needed time before coming home. What he could not imagine was that she had already made a decision far greater than leaving a hotel suite. She was not walking away from one terrible night. She was walking away from the life built upon it. 3 mornings later, sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows of Claire Bennett's apartment, but Evelyn still found herself waking before dawn. Sleep came in short pieces now, interrupted less by sadness than by questions she could not answer. Claire never pushed for details. She simply stocked the refrigerator with fresh fruit, prenatal vitamins, and herbal tea, creating a quiet space where healing did not require conversation. Nathan, however, refused to accept silence. Every morning flowers arrived. White roses on Monday, orchids on Tuesday, lilies on Wednesday. Every arrangement carried another handwritten note asking for one meeting, one conversation, one chance to explain. Evelyn never opened the envelopes. Claire donated every bouquet to the children's wing of a nearby hospital before breakfast. Meanwhile, news of the missing bride had quietly spread through New York's social circles. Business magazines that had celebrated the wedding only days earlier suddenly published careful speculation about an unexpected postponement of the honeymoon. Public relations teams from Brooks Capital insisted the couple simply wanted privacy. Nathan approved every statement himself, convinced that controlling the narrative would buy him enough time to bring Evelyn home before rumors became permanent. What he could not control was the growing distance between who he had been in public and who he had revealed himself to be in private. On Thursday afternoon, Claire suggested a short walk through Central Park. Fresh air helps, she said with an encouraging smile. Evelyn agreed, grateful for any excuse to leave the apartment without thinking about hotel suites, wedding dresses, or unanswered phone calls. The early autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves across winding pathways where joggers, dog walkers, and families enjoyed the mild afternoon. For nearly an hour, Evelyn felt almost invisible again, and that anonymity became a small gift. She stopped beside the lake, watching sunlight ripple across the water while children tossed pieces of bread toward curious ducks. Life continued with remarkable determination. As she turned toward a nearby coffee kiosk, someone held the door open before she could reach it. "After you," the stranger said politely. Evelyn looked up. The man appeared to be in his middle 30s, wearing a navy jacket instead of an expensive business suit despite the unmistakable confidence of someone accustomed to responsibility. His expression carried warmth rather than curiosity, and when he noticed the hesitation in her eyes, he simply smiled and stepped aside. "Thank you," Evelyn replied softly. She ordered a cup of decaffeinated tea while the man requested black coffee. Neither of them spoke again until the cashier frowned at the payment terminal. "I am sorry," the young cashier said. "Our system just froze for a moment." The stranger laughed gently. Technology always chooses the worst possible timing. Evelyn smiled despite herself. That seems to be true lately. The brief exchange might have ended there if the cashier had not accidentally called the man by name while handing over the receipt. "Here you go, Mr. Hayes." Evelyn recognized the surname immediately. Julian Hayes, founder of Hayes Dynamics. one of the youngest technology entrepreneurs ever to appear on the cover of Forbes. She had seen interviews with him before. Every magazine described him as brilliant, disciplined, and intensely private. He noticed the flicker of recognition in her expression and offered an almost embarrassed smile. The articles usually make me sound far more interesting than I actually am. Evelyn shook her head lightly. I was not thinking about the articles. Then what were you thinking? She looked toward the lake before answering. That sometimes people know a name without knowing the person. Julian considered those words carefully before nodding. That is probably more accurate than most headlines. They carried their drinks outside and happened to choose neighboring benches overlooking the water. Neither one asked personal questions. They spoke instead about the changing weather, the city's endless construction projects, and the quiet comfort of parks surrounded by skyscrapers. It was the first conversation Evelyn had enjoyed in days because it required nothing from her. Julian never asked why she looked exhausted. He never commented on the absence of a wedding ring. He never offered advice disguised as kindness. After several comfortable minutes, his phone buzzed repeatedly. He glanced at the screen, sighed almost apologetically, and slipped it back into his pocket. Work can wait another 5 minutes, he said with a faint smile. Evelyn looked at him curiously. Most executives would answer immediately. Julian shrugged. The people I care about deserve my full attention when they are sitting in front of me. The sentence lingered in Evelyn's thoughts long after he said it, not because it sounded extraordinary, but because it sounded sincere. As they stood to leave, Julian reached into his jacket and handed her a simple business card. If you ever need help finding the right lawyer, accountant, doctor, or even a good moving company, call the number on the back. No explanations required. Evelyn looked down at the card before meeting his eyes again. You do not even know me. Julian smiled gently. Sometimes that makes helping easier. Neither of them realized that a freelance photographer standing across the path had quietly captured the brief conversation from a distance, believing he had stumbled onto nothing more than an ordinary afternoon in Central Park. By the following morning, that single unnoticed photograph would begin changing far more lives than either of them could possibly imagine. The photograph appeared online just after 8 o'clock the next morning. It was not dramatic. There was no headline about romance, no scandalous caption, and no sensational accusation. It simply showed Evelyn Carter sitting on a park bench beside Julian Hayes, both holding paper cups while looking across the lake. Yet within an hour, thousands of people had begun sharing the image, attaching their own assumptions to a moment they did not understand. Nathan saw it during a board meeting. His assistant quietly placed a tablet beside him, believing he should know before the directors did. Nathan stared at the photograph without speaking. Julian Hayes was not just another businessman. He led one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America, and the financial press had spent years comparing his influence to the largest names on Wall Street. Nathan felt something unfamiliar tighten inside his chest. It was not jealousy. It was uncertainty. He had expected Evelyn to seek comfort with family or close friends. He had never imagined she would cross paths with someone whose name carried as much weight as his own. Across the conference room, the quarterly presentation continued while charts changed on the projection screen. Nathan heard none of it. His attention remained fixed on the photograph. Evelyn looked different. Not happier. Not healed, but calmer. She no longer looked like the woman standing speechless inside the hotel suite. She looked like someone beginning to breathe again. Nathan, one of the directors asked, "Should we continue?" He blinked, forcing himself back into the meeting. Yes, continue. But the numbers no longer held his attention. After the meeting ended, Nathan immediately instructed his legal advisor to prepare documents for a private settlement. I want everything resolved before the press invents more stories, he said. The attorney studied him carefully. Is your wife asking for a divorce? Nathan hesitated. Not yet. Then perhaps the first step is not paperwork. Perhaps the first step is honesty. Nathan looked away without answering. At the same time, another conversation was taking place several blocks away inside Brooks Capital's accounting department. Senior accountant Melissa Turner had spent the morning reviewing financial records connected to several holding companies created over the previous 2 years. She frowned as she noticed identical transfers moving between businesses with different names but the same mailing address. Curious, she opened another file. Then another. The pattern repeated itself. Several assets appeared to have been reassigned shortly before Nathan's wedding. She assumed there was a reasonable explanation until she discovered draft agreements dated months before the ceremony, discussing future property distribution in the event of a divorce. The dates troubled her. They suggested planning that had begun long before the marriage itself. Melissa quietly copied the files into a secure review folder and requested a confidential meeting with the company's outside auditors. She had no interest in office politics. She simply believed financial records should always tell the truth. Meanwhile, Evelyn spent the afternoon meeting with a family attorney recommended years earlier by Claire's father. Margaret Sullivan had practiced family law for nearly 3 decades and possessed the calm confidence of someone who had witnessed every possible version of heartbreak. She listened carefully without interrupting while Evelyn described only the facts she could personally confirm. When the conversation ended, Margaret folded her hands across the desk. "You are not asking for revenge," she observed. Evelyn shook her head. "I only want honesty." Margaret smiled gently. "That usually makes these cases much stronger." Before Evelyn left, the attorney handed her a short checklist. Bank statements, tax returns, insurance policies, corporate disclosures, property records. "Do not assume anything," Margaret advised. "Verify everything." Those 4 words echoed through Evelyn's thoughts during the drive back to Claire's apartment. Verify everything. She realized how often love had encouraged her to accept explanations without asking for evidence. That chapter of her life was over. Late that evening, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She almost ignored it before answering. "Miss Carter," a woman's voice asked. "My name is Melissa Turner. I work in the accounting department at Brooks Capital." Evelyn straightened immediately. "Is something wrong?" There was a long pause. "I cannot discuss details over the phone," Melissa replied carefully. "But I believe there are financial documents you deserve to see before anyone has an opportunity to move them." Evelyn's heartbeat quickened. "Why are you calling me?" Melissa answered with quiet certainty. "Because numbers do not lie, even when people do." The call ended less than a minute later, leaving Evelyn standing silently beside Claire's living room window while the evening lights of Manhattan stretched toward the horizon. Somewhere inside Brooks Capital, forgotten files were beginning to tell a story no wedding vow had ever revealed. And for the first time since leaving the hotel, Evelyn realized that the truth waiting ahead might be far larger than one broken marriage. 2 days later, Evelyn arrived at a quiet office building in Lower Manhattan just before 9 o'clock in the morning. The address Melissa Turner had given her belonged not to Brooks Capital, but to the law firm representing the company's independent auditors. Margaret Sullivan met her in the lobby and escorted her upstairs without unnecessary conversation. The conference room overlooked the East River, where ferries crossed the water beneath a gray autumn sky. A thick folder rested neatly in the center of the polished table. Melissa was already waiting. She stood as Evelyn entered, looking nervous but determined. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "I know this is difficult." Evelyn took a seat across from her. "You said there were documents I needed to see." Melissa nodded and carefully opened the folder. "Everything inside comes directly from company records. Nothing has been altered." Margaret quietly adjusted her glasses while Melissa slid the first page across the table. It was a timeline of financial transactions beginning nearly 6 months before the wedding. Evelyn recognized Nathan's signature on several corporate authorizations. There were transfers involving investment accounts, property holdings, and newly created limited liability companies. At first glance, the paperwork looked routine. Then Melissa pointed to the dates. "These entities were established before your engagement announcement," she explained. "At the time, I assumed they were part of a tax strategy. But when I continued reviewing the files, another pattern appeared." She placed a second document beside the first. It was a draft memorandum prepared by outside consultants discussing future asset separation under multiple personal scenarios. Evelyn read every line twice. Although her name never appeared, the language described a future spouse with remarkable precision. The projected timeline even anticipated the possibility of a child. Her breathing slowed as realization settled over the room. "These plans existed before he proposed," she whispered. Melissa lowered her eyes. "That is what the records suggest." Margaret remained composed. "Do we know whether these documents were finalized?" Melissa shook her head. "Not entirely. But there is more." She opened another section of the folder containing internal email correspondence. Several messages discussed moving ownership interests into separate companies while maintaining operational control. None of the emails explicitly mentioned divorce, yet together they painted a picture of careful preparation. Evelyn felt no surge of anger. Instead, she experienced something colder and far more permanent. Certainty. The unanswered questions that had haunted her since the wedding night slowly gave way to undeniable facts. Nathan had not simply made one terrible decision. He had been organizing pieces of his life long before she realized she was part of a strategy instead of a partnership. Margaret carefully arranged the documents into separate categories. These records deserve independent verification, she said. If confirmed, they will become extremely important. Melissa nodded. The auditors have already started reviewing everything. They noticed inconsistencies after I submitted my report. Evelyn looked toward the large windows where sunlight briefly broke through the clouds before disappearing again. Why risk your career for someone you do not know? Melissa smiled sadly. Because I watched you at the wedding rehearsal. Evelyn looked surprised. Melissa continued. You thanked every employee by name. You spoke to servers, photographers, drivers, and assistants as though each person mattered. Most executives never notice us. You did. The room fell silent. Kindness, Evelyn realized, sometimes returned in ways no one expected. Before the meeting ended, Margaret handed Evelyn copies of only the documents legally appropriate to retain. From this point forward, she said, we let the process work. Facts carry more weight than accusations. As Evelyn gathered the folder, her phone vibrated with an unfamiliar message. It came from Julian Hayes. I hope your appointment went well today. If you need introductions to financial forensic specialists, I know several people who are excellent at their work. No pressure. No questions. Just help if you want it. Evelyn stared at the message for a moment before replying with 6 simple words. Thank you. I may need that. Less than a minute later, his response appeared. Then you already have it. She slipped the phone into her purse, unaware that across town Nathan had just been informed that outside auditors were requesting additional records from Brooks Capital. His chief financial officer assured him it was probably a routine review, but the uneasiness in the executive offices suggested otherwise. Small questions had begun producing larger ones. Files once ignored were now being examined. Signatures were being compared. Dates were being matched. And somewhere inside thousands of ordinary pages, the quiet truth was assembling itself one document at a time, moving steadily toward a moment when no carefully prepared explanation would be enough to change what the evidence revealed. Nearly 11 months passed before Brooks Capital announced its annual Leadership and Innovation Gala, an event attended by investors, executives, journalists, and business leaders from across the country. Every major financial publication planned to cover Nathan Brooks as he prepared to unveil the company's most ambitious expansion in its history. Publicly, he had rebuilt his image with remarkable. The cool evening air outside the Grand Metropolitan Ballroom felt lighter than the silence Evelyn had just left behind. Camera flashes continued to sparkle near the entrance as reporters rushed to file breaking stories, but she did not slow down to answer a single question. For nearly a year, she had imagined what this moment might feel like. She had expected satisfaction, perhaps relief. Instead, she felt something far quieter. Peace. Julian walked beside her without speaking, understanding that some victories needed silence more than celebration. A Blacktown car waited near the curb, but before either of them reached it, a familiar voice called her name. Evelyn. She stopped without turning immediately. Nathan stood several yards away beneath the soft glow of the hotel's entrance lights. His tuxedo was still perfectly tailored, yet something about the confidence he had carried for so many years had disappeared. There were no cameras pointed directly at him anymore. No executives waiting for instructions. No carefully rehearsed speech left to deliver. For the first time since she had met him, he looked like an ordinary man forced to stand alone with the consequences of his own choices. Evelyn slowly faced him. Neither of them moved closer. The distance between them seemed appropriate somehow, measured not in feet, but in everything that had happened since the wedding night. Nathan lowered his eyes briefly before speaking. I spent months trying to think of the right explanation. Evelyn listened quietly. Tonight, I realized there never was one. The honesty in his voice sounded different from anything she had heard before because it arrived too late to ask for anything in return. I thought I could fix everything, he continued. I believed success solved every problem. I was wrong. Evelyn nodded gently. You were. He looked toward the city skyline stretching behind her. I do not expect forgiveness. That is good, she answered softly. Because forgiveness is something I will choose for myself, not something anyone else gets to request. Nathan closed his eyes for a brief moment before offering the smallest smile of acceptance. I hope one day our child knows that I finally learned the difference. Evelyn rested her hand lightly against the stroller beside her, where her beautiful infant daughter slept peacefully beneath a cream-colored blanket. She had given birth 3 months earlier, and every difficult decision she had made since leaving the hotel had led to this quiet moment. Her daughter had never witnessed betrayal. She would grow up surrounded by honesty instead. Whether she knows you, Evelyn said calmly, will depend on the choices you make from this day forward, not the promises you make tonight. Nathan nodded once. There was nothing left to argue. No negotiation remained. He quietly stepped back, allowing her path to remain clear. Julian opened the car door without interrupting the conversation or pretending to rescue her from it. He simply waited. Evelyn looked at Nathan one final time. She did not see the successful executive she had once admired. She saw a man who had finally discovered that character could not be hidden behind wealth, influence, or carefully managed appearances forever. The truth had reached him long after it had reached everyone else. She entered the car, and as the door closed gently behind her, Nathan remained standing beneath the hotel lights while traffic flowed steadily through the streets of Manhattan. Life moved forward without pausing for regret. 6 months later, Brooks Capital completed a major corporate restructuring under new leadership. Independent investigations concluded without dramatic courtroom scenes or public spectacle. Policies changed. Oversight improved. Shareholders elected a new board chairman. Melissa Turner accepted a promotion after helping strengthen the company's financial compliance systems. Margaret Sullivan quietly returned to representing families whose greatest victories rarely appeared in newspaper headlines. Claire remained the loyal friend who had opened her home on the darkest night of Evelyn's life. As for Julian, he never tried to replace anyone. He simply remained present, consistently proving through ordinary actions that trust was built one day at a time rather than promised in a single speech. One crisp autumn afternoon, Evelyn pushed the stroller through Central Park beneath trees glowing with shades of gold and crimson. Children laughed nearby, while musicians played soft jazz beneath the changing leaves. Her daughter reached toward the sunlight filtering through the branches, smiling with the uncomplicated joy only a child could possess. Julian walked beside them carrying 2 cups of warm apple cider, handing one to Evelyn before gently adjusting the blanket around the stroller. Neither of them spoke for several peaceful moments. They did not need to. Some stories ended with dramatic revenge. This one ended with something far more valuable. A woman who once walked away carrying only heartbreak now walked forward carrying hope. Behind her remained broken promises, hidden plans, and a life built on appearances. Ahead of her stood honesty, quiet strength, and the freedom to choose differently. Because in the end, the greatest victory was never watching someone else lose everything. It was refusing to lose yourself while they did.